Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, way back, to a world where gas lamps flickered, horse-drawn carriages rattled over cobblestones, and the relentless hum of industrialization was just beginning to truly grip society. Imagine yourself, draped in heavy woolens, trudging through the smoky London fog after a grueling day in a bustling factory, or perhaps after hours spent hunched over delicate lace in a dimly lit parlor. The air is thick with the scent of coal smoke and damp earth, and your bones ache with a weariness that modern life, with all its ergonomic chairs and noise-canceling headphones, can scarcely replicate. You're utterly exhausted, yet sleep, that elusive balm, refuses to come. You toss, you turn, you count imaginary sheep that look suspiciously like soot-covered mill workers. This, my friends, was the grim reality for many in the Victorian era, a time when the demands of a rapidly changing world collided with an almost desperate yearning for a good night's rest. You probably won't survive this level of chronic sleep deprivation without resorting to some rather peculiar methods. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening in, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? It's always fascinating to see where you all are drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins, as many do, with a problem: insomnia. But not just any insomnia. This was Victorian insomnia, a malady that seemed to sweep through the social strata like a particularly stubborn cough. Life in the 19th century, while perhaps romanticized in period dramas, was undeniably taxing. For the working classes, days were long and arduous, often beginning before dawn and ending well after dusk, spent in factories with deafening machinery or in cramped, unhygienic conditions. Imagine the constant din, the relentless pace, the sheer physical exhaustion that would build day after day. You'd think sleep would be a blessed escape, wouldn't you? Yet, the very conditions that wore them out also conspired against restful slumber. Overcrowding in tenements meant shared beds, thin walls, and the constant cacophony of city life just outside the window. Privacy was a luxury, silence a myth. Meanwhile, for the burgeoning middle and upper classes, the pressures were different but no less potent. The rapid expansion of commerce and industry meant longer hours in offices, endless paperwork, and the mental strain of managing burgeoning enterprises. Social calendars were packed with formal dinners, balls, and calls, often stretching late into the night. The strict social codes of the era demanded constant vigilance, an exhausting performance of propriety and decorum. Even the simple act of reading became more prevalent, with novels published in serials, keeping eager minds stimulated far past a sensible bedtime. Historians still argue whether the increased incidence of insomnia was truly a new phenomenon or merely a newly recognized and discussed affliction, brought to light by a society that was increasingly turning its gaze inward, analyzing its own ailments with a newfound scientific curiosity. One mainstream historical fact to consider is the sheer lack of effective pain relief or simple comfort measures that we take for granted today. A toothache, a persistent cough, a lingering headache, these weren't minor annoyances to be popped away with an ibuprofen. They were constant, nagging torments that could easily disrupt sleep for nights on end. Imagine trying to drift off when every nerve ending is screaming, or when a hacking cough keeps you upright every hour. This constant physical discomfort, combined with the daily grind, created a perfect storm for sleeplessness. And here's a quirky tidbit. The Victorians, with their love for order and self-improvement, also had a peculiar fascination with nervous energy. It was believed that the modern world, with its telegraphs, trains, and endless social engagements, was simply too stimulating, overwhelming the delicate nervous system. This led to a widespread diagnosis of neurasthenia, a catch-all term for various symptoms including fatigue, anxiety, and, of course, insomnia. It wasn't just physical exhaustion. It was a perceived mental and emotional overstimulation, a kind of existential burnout from the very progress they so celebrated. This idea of being over-civilized or overstimulated truly captured the public imagination. So, as you lie there, perhaps scrolling through your phone, feeling a little too connected to the digital world, spare a thought for the Victorians who felt similarly overwhelmed by the sheer pace of their own innovation and desperately just wanted to shut their eyes. With sleep proving an increasingly elusive dream, Victorians, ever resourceful, turned to what was readily available and often what was strongly advertised, laudanum. Now, if you're picturing something quaint and harmless, like a chamomile tea before bed, you're quite a few centuries off. Laudanum was essentially tincture of opium, a potent solution of opium dissolved in alcohol, and it was everywhere. Imagine walking into your local apothecary or even a general store and seeing bottles of this powerful narcotic openly displayed, marketed as a cure for everything from coughs and colds to, you guessed it, insomnia. It was the ubiquitous over-the-counter sleep aid of its day, available to anyone with a few pennies to spare. You see, the Victorians lived in a world where modern pharmaceuticals simply didn't exist. Pain was a constant companion for many, and effective relief was scarce. Opium, in its various forms, had been known for centuries for its analgesic and sedative properties. Laudanum offered a quick, albeit temporary, escape from both physical pain and the gnawing anxiety that often accompanied sleepless nights. It was cheap, easy to administer, and, crucially, it worked at least in the short term. You'd simply measure out a few drops, perhaps in a glass of water, and soon enough, that restless mind would quiet, and sleep, or at least a deep stupor, would descend. The widespread embrace of laudanum, however, came with a dark side, one that historians still debate the full extent of. While it provided immediate relief, it was also highly addictive. Regular use quickly led to dependence, and withdrawal symptoms could be excruciating. Imagine the cycle. You take laudanum to sleep, but then you need more to feel normal, and even more to truly rest. It was a vicious loop for many, particularly for women who were often prescribed it for nervous complaints or hysteria, terms that often masked underlying anxiety, depression, or simply the stifling constraints of Victorian life. It wasn't just adults either. Laudanum was even given to children, often in the form of soothing syrups, to quiet restless babies, leading to tragic instances of accidental overdose and chronic addiction from infancy. One mainstream historical fact to underscore is that the Victorian era predated any meaningful drug regulation. There were no government bodies overseeing the purity, dosage, or even the labeling of these potent concoctions. Manufacturers could make almost any claim they wished, and the public, desperate for relief, had little recourse or knowledge to question them. This created a fertile ground for both genuine, albeit dangerous, remedies and outright quackery. You might pick up a bottle promising peaceful slumber, unaware that you were inviting a tiger into your home. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Victorian doctors surprisingly recommended gradual withdrawal for laudanum addicts, a concept that sounds eerily modern but often involved simply reducing the dose over time, without understanding the full physiological complexities of addiction. It was a step, perhaps, but a tiny one in a vast, dark ocean. Another peculiar habit was adding laudanum to everyday beverages. Imagine your great-great-grandmother casually stirring a few drops into her afternoon tea to take the edge off a particularly stressful day. It truly highlights how deeply ingrained and normalized opium use was in certain circles. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of laudanum was a pragmatic solution in an era without better options or a catastrophic public health crisis waiting to happen. The reality is likely a complex blend of both. It certainly offered a temporary reprieve for suffering individuals, but at a profound cost to many lives, creating generations of people dependent on a substance that was effectively legal and readily available. The sweet dreams promised by the bottle often turned into a waking nightmare of addiction and despair. The Victorian night, it seems, was not always as tranquil as we might imagine from afar. If laudanum was the blunt instrument of sleep induction, then the world of patent medicine was its flamboyant, unregulated carnival. Imagine a wild west of tonics, elixirs, and pills, each promising to cure every conceivable ailment, from consumption to constipation, and of course, that persistent foe, sleeplessness. These were not medicines in the modern sense. They were proprietary concoctions, often with secret ingredients, aggressively marketed to a public hungry for relief. You'd open your newspaper, or perhaps a popular magazine, and be bombarded with advertisements for Dar, so-and-so's miraculous sleeping draft, or Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, another infamous child sedative, frequently containing opium. It was a golden age for bold claims and dubious ingredients. The genius, if you can call it that, of patent medicine lay in its accessibility and its appeal to hope. People were desperate, and these products offered a glimmer of a cure, often packaged in attractive bottles with impressive labels, promising everything but the moon. You didn't need a doctor's prescription indeed. Many people distrusted doctors, especially if they couldn't afford their fees. These remedies were bought directly from pharmacies, general stores, or even traveling salesmen, making them a cornerstone of self-medication in the Victorian home. The ingredients varied wildly. Some were relatively harmless, like herbal concoctions, while others contained potent and dangerous substances like alcohol, chloroform, or, predictably, generous doses of opium or morphine. The more potent the active ingredient, the more likely the customer would report feeling better or experiencing sleep, thus reinforcing the product's supposed efficacy. Imagine a tired Victorian mother up all night with a restless child, seeing an advertisement for a children's comfort cordial. The bottle promises quiet nights and peaceful dreams. What she doesn't know, or perhaps doesn't want to know in her desperation, is that she's administering a potent dose of an opiate. It's a terrifying thought from our modern perspective, where such practices are unthinkable, but in the chaotic, pre-regulation landscape of Victorian medicine, it was shockingly common. These syrups were the original quiet time solution with devastating potential. One mainstream historical fact about patent medicines is their enormous financial success. Companies built vast fortunes on these unregulated remedies, creating elaborate advertising campaigns that predated modern marketing by decades. They used testimonials, sensational headlines, and evocative imagery to capture the public's imagination and loosen their purse strings. This was consumerism in its rawest, most unbridled form, where profit often trumped public safety. It truly was the Wild West of wellness, before anyone thought to draw up a sheriff's badge. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some of these patent medicines for sleep actually contain belladonna, a highly toxic plant also known as deadly nightshade. While it has sedative properties in very small doses, its narrow therapeutic window meant that taking slightly too much could lead to alarming side effects, including hallucinations, delirium, and even death. So, your quest for a peaceful night might have inadvertently led you to a very unsettling, perhaps even fatal, trip. One moment you're trying to drift off, the next you're seeing pink elephants in your bedroom. Not exactly conducive to restful slumber, unless your idea of restful is quite unconventional. Historians still argue whether the patent medicine boom was primarily a symptom of public gullibility, a testament to the lack of effective medical alternatives, or a cynical exploitation of human suffering. It's likely a bit of all three. While some remedies offered mild palliative relief, many were simply ineffective placebos, and a significant number were actively harmful, creating widespread addiction and health problems. The allure of a quick fix, of a secret formula promising effortless slumber, proved irresistible to a population desperately seeking respite from the relentless demands of their era. You might chuckle at their credulity, but then again, how many miracle cures do we still see advertised today, just with shinier packaging and perhaps slightly less opium? Having explored the chemical shortcuts to slumber, let's pivot to something that might seem equally surprising in the context of soothing sleep: electrotherapy. Imagine, if you will, being offered electricity as a cure for your restless nights. Sounds more like a jolt to wake you up than to lull you to sleep, doesn't it? Yet, in the Victorian era, electricity, still a relatively new and mysterious force, was hailed by some as a panacea for a host of ailments, including nervous disorders and, by extension, insomnia. It was seen as a way to rebalance the body's vital energies, much like a modern-day chiropractor might adjust your spine, only with more sparks. You'd be invited into a doctor's office, or perhaps a dedicated electric institute, where you'd recline on a comfortable chair or even a specialized bed. Wires would be attached to various points on your body, perhaps your temples, your wrists, or even your spine. Then, a low-level current would be passed through you. It wasn't the kind of shock you'd get from touching a faulty wire. It was generally a mild, pulsating current, sometimes described as a tingling or vibrating sensation. The idea was that this gentle electrical stimulation would soothe agitated nerves, relax muscles, and ultimately induce a state of calm conducive to sleep. It was a fascinating blend of genuine scientific curiosity, burgeoning understanding of electricity, and a healthy dose of showmanship. Think of it, the mysterious power that lit their new streetlights and powered their burgeoning industries was now, supposedly, capable of lulling you into a peaceful slumber. It offered a seemingly modern and scientific alternative to the often dubious patent medicines or the addictive allure of laudanum. For those who could afford it, electrotherapy carried an air of sophistication and cutting-edge medical advancement. It felt respectable, a treatment for the well-heeled anxieties of the professional class. One could imagine a weary banker, exhausted from the day's financial machinations, seeking solace in a vibrating chair, hoping to zap away his worries and usher in a night of tranquil rest. One mainstream historical fact about electrotherapy is that it was also used to treat a wide range of other conditions, including paralysis, rheumatism, and even hysteria. It became a fad, much like certain wellness trends today, with practitioners setting up clinics and even selling portable home devices for self-treatment. You could literally buy a battery-powered electric brush or electric belt to zap yourself at home, promising everything from improved digestion to enhanced vitality and, of course, better sleep. The belief in its curative powers was incredibly strong, fueled by anecdotal evidence and the sheer novelty of the technology. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some electrotherapy sessions involve placing electrodes directly on the patient's head, sometimes even attempting to recharge specific brain areas. Imagine lying there, a metal cap on your head, humming with a low current, while the doctor assures you that your brain cells are being gently coaxed into a state of blissful repose. It sounds almost like science fiction, doesn't it? The sensory experience itself, the mild buzz, the hum of the machine, the earnest pronouncements of the practitioner might have been enough to distract a restless mind and, through sheer expectation, induce a sense of relaxation, if not actual therapeutic sleep. Historians still argue whether the perceived benefits of electrotherapy were primarily due to the placebo effect, the inherent relaxation of lying still in a quiet room, or if there was a genuine, albeit poorly understood, physiological impact. While modern medicine uses precise forms of electrotherapy for specific conditions, the broad, often indiscriminate application in the Victorian era suggests that much of its success was psychological. It offered hope, a sense of control, and a scientific-sounding explanation for their suffering, which, for a stressed Victorian, might have been half the battle won against sleeplessness. Perhaps a mild electrical current did offer a gentle distraction, a shift in focus from the anxieties of the day to the curious sensation of a buzz. And sometimes, distraction is all you need to finally drift off. From sparks and currents, we now turn our attention to something far more earthy, though no less peculiar in the Victorian quest for sleep: dietary fads. You might imagine a world of bland gruel and boiled vegetables, but the truth is, Victorians were surprisingly experimental with their food, especially when it came to health. And when sleep was on the line, people were willing to try almost anything, no matter how unappetizing or illogical it might seem to our modern palates. The prevailing wisdom often lacked scientific rigor, instead relying on anecdotal evidence, outdated humoral theories, or the latest pronouncement from self-proclaimed health gurus. Imagine yourself, a weary Victorian, being told that your sleeplessness could be cured by a specific meal, or perhaps the complete avoidance of another. One popular theory revolved around the idea that indigestion was a primary culprit for disturbed sleep. Therefore, light, easily digestible meals were often recommended for dinner. But what constituted light was sometimes quite subjective. You might be advised to consume nothing but a bowl of thin broth and a single piece of toast, or perhaps to entirely skip dinner altogether, going to bed on an empty, rumbling stomach. The logic was that a full stomach would divert vital energy to digestion, leaving the brain too stimulated to rest. You can almost hear your stomach protesting the thought of skipping dinner, can't you? Conversely, some advise specific sleep-inducing foods. Oatmeal, for example, was often recommended, perhaps due to its perceived digestibility and mild flavor. A warm bowl of porridge before bed was a common suggestion, not unlike some modern remedies that suggest warm milk. However, the Victorian approach often took things to extremes. There were detailed regimens outlining precisely what to eat, when to eat it, and what to absolutely avoid. Imagine trying to adhere to a strict dietary schedule after a long, exhausting day, all in the desperate hope of catching a few winks. It almost sounds like another source of stress, doesn't it? One mainstream historical fact about Victorian dietary advice is the strong emphasis on temperance. Alcohol, while sometimes used as a sedative and often an unlisted ingredient in patent medicines, was frequently blamed for restless nights due to its stimulating after effects. So, you'd be advised to forego that evening glass of sherry, even if you felt it helped you unwind. Tea and coffee, with their obvious stimulating properties, were also often on the banned list for insomniacs, especially in the hours leading up to bedtime. It was a sensible piece of advice. To be fair, that still holds true today, but the zeal with which it was sometimes enforced could be quite extreme. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Victorian health reformers advocated for something called the Graham diet, popularized by Sylvester Graham, the inventor of the graham cracker. This diet was strictly vegetarian and emphasized whole grains and bland foods, specifically avoiding meat, spices, and anything deemed stimulating. The idea was that such a diet would purify the body and mind, leading to better overall health, including more restful sleep. Imagine having to endure a meal of unseasoned whole grain crackers and water just to catch some ZS. It sounds less like a cure for insomnia and more like a punishment for existing. You could hardly blame someone for sneaking a hidden sausage under their pillow, could you? Historians still argue whether these elaborate dietary restrictions actually had any physiological effect on sleep beyond potentially alleviating indigestion for some. It's likely that the psychological impact of adhering to a healthy regimen, combined with the mild sedative effects of certain foods like oats, played a larger role than any specific chemical properties. The act of engaging in a structured routine, even a peculiar one, could provide a sense of control and calm to an anxious mind. So, while you might not be rushing out for a bowl of plain gruel tonight, the Victorian belief in food as medicine, even for sleep, offers a fascinating glimpse into their persistent search for nocturnal peace. From what they ate, let's now consider where they slept, because the very environment of the Victorian bedroom played a crucial, often overlooked, role in the quest for restful slumber. Forget your minimalist, clutter-free sanctuary. The Victorian bedroom was often a far more complex affair, laden with heavy fabrics, ornate furniture, and a surprising number of objects that, to our modern eyes, might seem counterintuitive for sleep. Yet, great pains were taken to prepare these spaces, reflecting the era's deep-seated beliefs about health, hygiene, and the delicate balance required for a good night's rest. Imagine stepping into a Victorian bedroom. It's likely dim, even in the middle of the day, with heavy velvet or brocade curtains drawn to block out the light and, crucially, the drafts. Drafts, you see, were a Victorian obsession, blamed for everything from colds to consumption, and certainly for disturbing sleep. So, windows were often kept tightly shut, even in summer, leading to rather stuffy, unventilated spaces. You might find a four-poster bed, grand and imposing, draped in more heavy fabrics canopies, valances, and thick bed curtains. These weren't just for show. They were intended to create a cozy, enclosed microclimate, further protecting the sleeper from drafts and outside noise. It sounds warm, perhaps a little too warm for some, but it was all about containment and protection. The mattress itself would likely be stuffed with natural materials like horsehair, wool, or straw, which offered varying degrees of firmness and comfort, but certainly weren't the memory foam wonders we enjoy today. And beneath that, a bed warmer might be employed on chilly nights, a metal pan filled with hot coals, carefully glided between the sheets to take the chill off before you climbed in. It's a rather charming thought, isn't it? Preparing your bed with warmth before you even occupy it? Though you'd certainly want to make sure those coals were out before you drifted off, unless you fancied a rather toasty, albeit smoky, wake-up call. One mainstream historical fact about Victorian bedrooms is the emphasis on cleanliness and order, at least in theory. While some working-class homes were undeniably cramped and unsanitary, middle and upper-class bedrooms were often meticulously maintained. Linens were changed frequently, and efforts were made to keep dust at bay. This focus on hygiene was part of a broader Victorian movement towards public health, recognizing the link between sanitation and well-being. A clean room, it was believed, was a healthy room, and a healthy body was more prone to restful sleep. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Victorians believed that certain plants in the bedroom could improve air quality or even aid sleep. While not always scientifically accurate, potted plants were a common sight. Conversely, there was a widespread belief that night air was inherently unhealthy and could bring disease. This fear contributed to the practice of keeping windows tightly shut, even when it led to stifling conditions. So, while you might crack open a window for a breath of fresh air before bed, a Victorian would have been horrified by the notion, convinced they were inviting illness and restless spirits into their sanctum. It truly highlights the contrast in our understanding of sleep hygiene. Historians still argue whether the perceived benefits of these elaborate bedroom setups were truly physiological, or if the psychological comfort of being cocooned, protected from the outside world, was the more significant factor in promoting sleep. The sheer effort involved in creating such a space, the heavy curtains, the closed windows, the warmed bed likely instilled a sense of ritual and security that could calm an anxious mind. So, while you might find a Victorian bedroom a tad claustrophobic for its inhabitants, it was a carefully constructed haven designed to usher in that most desired of states, oblivion. Having encased themselves in cozy, if perhaps stuffy, bedrooms, Victorians also looked outward for sleep solutions, often embracing the seemingly simple yet profoundly impactful combination of exercise and fresh air. While today we take for granted the benefits of a brisk walk or a workout for stress relief and improved sleep, for the Victorians, this connection was still being explored, often within the broader framework of physical culture and a burgeoning belief in the virtues of a robust constitution. You see, a tired body, they reasoned, was a body ready for sleep. Imagine being encouraged to take a daily constitutional, a vigorous walk, or perhaps engage in some light calisthenics, all under the firm belief that physical exertion would exhaust the body just enough to usher in peaceful slumber. For many, especially in the growing urban centers, access to truly fresh air was a luxury, but the idea persisted that time spent outdoors, away from the stuffy confines of their homes and offices, was crucial. Gardens became popular retreats. Public parks were designed to offer green spaces for recreation, and even a simple stroll around the block after dinner was seen as beneficial. It was about shaking off the mental cobwebs and the physical stagnation of the day. This wasn't about competitive sports or intense gym sessions, which were still largely the domain of a select few. This was about gentle, sustained activity. Think less of a marathon runner and more of a leisurely yet determined stroller. The advice often prescribed activities like gardening, cycling, as bicycles became more common, or even just simple drills in the fresh air. The belief was that such activities would invigorate the blood, clear the lungs, and tire the muscles in a healthy way, preparing the body for a truly restorative night's rest. It sounds almost quaint, doesn't it? The idea that a good walk could solve your deepest sleep woes? But then again, how many of us still find that a post-dinner stroll works wonders? One mainstream historical fact to note is the rise of the sanatorium movement during this era. For those suffering from chronic illnesses, including nervous exhaustion, a common synonym for chronic fatigue and insomnia, a stay in a rural sanatorium or health spa was often prescribed. These institutions emphasized fresh air, a healthy diet, and moderate exercise as primary therapeutic interventions. The clean, unpolluted air of the countryside, combined with structured physical activity, was believed to be profoundly restorative, especially for those whose sleep had been shattered by the stresses of urban life. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some proponents of physical culture even suggested specific breathing exercises to be performed outdoors before bed. Imagine standing in your garden, under the gaslight glow, slowly inhaling and exhaling, with the aim of drawing in pure, sleep-inducing vital force from the night air. While the scientific understanding of oxygen and respiration was still developing, the intent was clearly there, to purify the body and calm the mind through deliberate breathing, performed in the belief that the air itself held restorative properties. It was a kind of mindful meditation, Victorian style, with a healthy dose of mystical belief in the air's inherent power. Historians still argue whether the effectiveness of these exercise and fresh air regimens was primarily due to their direct physiological impact, or if the psychological benefit of adhering to a structured routine and the removal from stressful environments played a more significant role. Undoubtedly, both contributed. Physical activity naturally helps regulate sleep cycles, and spending time outdoors can expose you to natural light cues that support a healthy circadian rhythm. But the very act of doing something proactive, of following prescribed advice, likely instilled a sense of purpose and calm that was itself conducive to sleep. So, while you might find yourself reaching for a podcast during your evening stroll, a Victorian might have been contemplating the very air they breathe, hoping it would carry them gently into dreamland. From a sensible, if sometimes extreme, approaches of diet and exercise, we now venture into the more esoteric corners of Victorian sleep solutions, the realms of hypnosis and mesmerism. These practices, often shrouded in an aura of mystery and spectacle, offered a profoundly different kind of intervention for the restless mind. Far from the chemical compounds or physical exertions, this was about the power of suggestion, the subtle manipulation of the subconscious, and the belief that a heightened mental state could usher in profound relaxation and ultimately sleep. Imagine yourself seated opposite a mesmerist or hypnotist, their gaze intense, their voice soft and rhythmic. They might make slow, sweeping passes with their hands over your body, or perhaps hold a pendulum, its gentle swing intended to capture your full attention. The goal was to induce a trance-like state, a deep relaxation where your conscious mind receded and your susceptibility to suggestion increased. In this state, the practitioner would issue calming commands, suggesting peaceful sleep, the release of anxieties, and a quietude that bypassed the usual mental chatter, keeping you awake. It was less about administering a cure and more about guiding the mind to heal itself, or at least to think it was healing itself. This was a fascinating period for the exploration of the mind's power over the body, predating modern psychology by decades. Mesmerism, named after Franz Mesmer, who theorized about animal magnetism, was particularly popular in the earlier Victorian period, often blurring the lines between genuine therapy, stage performance, and outright charlatanism. You might find a mesmerist performing at a public hall, demonstrating their power to induce sleep or even anesthesia in volunteers, only to later offer private sessions for a fee. It certainly added a touch of drama to the search for sleep, a far cry from a quiet cup of chamomile. One mainstream historical fact about these practices is that they laid some of the groundwork for later psychological theories, particularly in the study of the unconscious mind. While many of the initial claims were exaggerated or unfounded, The observation that people could enter altered states of consciousness and respond to suggestion was undeniably real. Figures like James Braid, who coined the term hypnosis, attempted to bring a more scientific rigor to these phenomena, moving them away from the purely mystical and toward the physiological explanation. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some mesmerists claim to be able to induce clairvoyant sleep, where patients in a trance state could supposedly perceive things beyond normal sensory perception, or even diagnose their own ailments. Imagine trying to fall asleep, and instead finding yourself suddenly able to discern the contents of a neighbor's pantry through a wall. Not exactly restful, but certainly peculiar. These sensational claims, while boosting the popularity of mesmerism, also led to much skepticism and controversy, with many in the medical establishment dismissing it as quackery or trickery. The idea of someone putting you to sleep and then asking you about the weather in Timbuktu certainly wasn't conducive to calm. Historians still argue whether the effectiveness of mesmerism and hypnosis for insomnia was primarily due to the potent power of suggestion and the placebo effect, or if there was a deeper physiological mechanism at play that helped calm the nervous system. For many Victorians desperate for sleep, the experience itself, the focused attention, the soothing voice, and the belief in the mesmerist's power likely provided a powerful psychological shift, allowing their overactive minds to finally settle. It was an intriguing blend of science, showmanship, and the enduring human need for belief in a cure, even if that cure was largely in the mind. As the Victorians grappled with the elusive nature of sleep, their inventive spirit, so evident in the industrial boom, also turned its gaze to the bedroom, giving rise to some truly curious mechanical sleep aids. Forget your white noise machines or weighted blankets. These were often elaborate, sometimes clunky, devices designed to physically coax, rock, or even vibrate you into slumber. It was the era's answer to modern sleep tech, born from a blend of nascent engineering and a hopeful, sometimes misguided, understanding of the human body. Imagine, if you will, the rocking bed, a rather literal interpretation of a cradle for adults. This wasn't some gentle sway from side to side. Some designs incorporated mechanisms that would slowly, continuously rock the entire bed frame, mimicking the soothing motion of a baby's cot. The idea, of course, was to replicate the comforting, rhythmic movement that often lulled infants to sleep, hoping it would work just as effectively for stressed-out adults. You'd climb in, perhaps with a slight creak from the springs, and then slowly, inexorably, begin to gently rock back and forth, or even up and down, throughout the night. It sounds rather like being on a very calm boat, doesn't it? Or perhaps, if the mechanism wasn't perfectly oiled, like being trapped in a slowly collapsing contraption. Then there were the head vibrators or scalp massagers, rudimentary devices often operated by hand crank, or, as electricity became more common, by small motors. These contraptions featured soft bristles or blunt prongs designed to gently vibrate or massage the scalp. The theory was that this stimulation would increase blood flow to the head, relax the nerves, and somehow unwind the overactive brain, leading to peaceful sleep. You might picture a contraption resembling a slightly alarming hairbrush with a motor attached, buzzing gently around your temples. It's a far cry from a relaxing temple rub, more like a mild dental drill targeting your brain. One mainstream historical fact about these mechanical aids is that their development was part of a broader trend of mechanization and invention that permeated Victorian society. If a problem existed, surely a machine could be built to solve it. From complex factory machinery to household gadgets, the belief in technological solutions was profound. Sleep, as a persistent and widespread problem, naturally became a target for this inventive zeal, even if the resulting devices were more often curiosities than genuine breakthroughs. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some of the more elaborate sleep machines even incorporated rhythmic sound elements. Picture a device that didn't just rock you, but also emitted a steady, monotonous ticking or a gentle whirring sound, a precursor to today's white noise machines. The aim was to provide a consistent, non-distracting auditory input that would help override the myriad sounds of a bustling Victorian street or a noisy household. It's almost like they were reaching for the calm of a steady train journey without the actual journey. However, the quality of these early sound devices was likely rudimentary, and one can imagine a persistent whirring becoming more of an irritant than a lullaby after a few hours. Historians still argue whether these mechanical sleep aids offered any genuine physiological benefit beyond the placebo effect and the psychological comfort of engaging in a structured cure. While a gentle rocking motion can indeed be soothing, and a scalp massage might temporarily relax muscles, the often clumsy nature of these early machines suggests that their true efficacy was limited. Nevertheless, they stand as fascinating testaments to a society desperately searching for an engineering solution to an age-old human problem, willing to try almost anything to finally, mercifully, drift off. From the curious contraptions designed to rock you to sleep, we glide into another popular Victorian therapeutic trend: water cures and hydrotherapy. If you thought electrical shocks were surprising, wait until you hear about being wrapped in cold, wet sheets, or subjected to elaborate douches, all in the name of a good night's sleep. The Victorians, ever keen on the latest health fads, embraced water with an almost religious fervor, believing in its purifying, calming, and invigorating properties. Imagine yourself, perhaps feeling particularly stressed and sleep-deprived, being advised to take a cold bath just before bed. Yes, you heard that right, cold. The theory was that a sudden plunge into cold water would shock the system, invigorating the nerves, improving circulation, and ultimately preparing the body for a deep, restorative sleep. It sounds rather counterintuitive, doesn't it? Like trying to calm a startled cat with a sudden splash. You'd emerge shivering, perhaps, but the proponents claimed it was precisely this initial shock followed by the body's natural warming response that led to a profound relaxation. For those brave enough to try, the promise of peaceful slumber was a strong motivator. Beyond simple cold baths, hydrotherapy treatments could become quite elaborate. There were wet sheet packs, where you'd be tightly wrapped in sheets soaked in cold water, then covered with blankets to encourage a slow, gradual warming. The idea was to induce sweating and detoxification, along with a deep sense of relaxation as your body adjusted to the temperature. You might lie there, feeling a strange mixture of chill and emerging warmth, listening to the gentle drip of water, hoping this rather damp embrace would finally lull you into unconsciousness. Some institutions even featured specialized showers or douches that directed jets of water at different parts of the body, believed to stimulate nerves and muscles. It was less about a leisurely soak and more about a medical procedure involving a lot of splashing. One mainstream historical fact about hydrotherapy is its origins in the water cure movement, popularized by figures like Vincent's Priestnitz in Silesia. These methods gained immense popularity across Europe and North America, leading to the establishment of numerous hydrotherapy sanitaria where patients would reside for weeks or months, undergoing a strict regimen of water treatments, diet, and exercise. These institutions often attracted a clientele suffering from nervous disorders and chronic fatigue, with sleep improvement being a primary goal. The sheer proliferation of these water cure establishments speaks to the era's widespread belief in the power of water for healing. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some hydrotherapy protocols involved enemas of pure water administered before bed, believed to cleanse the internal system and thereby promote more restful sleep. Imagine adding that to your nightly routine in the hopes of catching some ZS. It certainly takes the concept of flushing out toxins to a whole new and, frankly, rather intrusive level. One can only hope the benefits were truly profound to justify such an internal approach. It certainly adds a new layer of meaning to the phrase, sleeping like a baby, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether the perceived benefits of hydrotherapy were primarily due to the physiological effects of temperature regulation and improved circulation, or if the rigorous routine, the change of scenery in a sanatorium, and a strong placebo effect played a more significant role. The discipline of the treatments, combined with the focus on self-care and the belief in the cure, undoubtedly contributed to many patients feeling better, including sleeping more soundly. So, while you might prefer a warm shower before bed, the Victorians were often quite literally chilling out to find their way to dreamland. Stepping away from the physical interventions of baths and mechanical aids, we delve now into the Victorians' attempts at calming the mind directly through practices we might broadly categorize as mental hygiene. This wasn't psychology as we know it today, but rather a collection of informal strategies, often rooted in moral philosophy, self-discipline, and the nascent understanding of the brain's influence on well-being. For a society grappling with rapid change, quieting the incessant churn of thoughts was a desperate need, particularly when faced with sleepless nights. Imagine being advised to engage in a rigorous process of introspection before bed. You might be told to review your day, not in an anxious way, but almost like a detached observer, identifying any worries or unresolved issues and consciously setting them aside. The idea was to put your house in order mentally, to clear the clutter of daily concerns so that your mind could truly rest. This often involved journaling or simply lying in bed and systematically dismissing each intrusive thought, as if filing it away for morning review. It required a level of mental discipline that, frankly, sounds exhausting in itself, especially when you're already bone-tired. Then there was the emphasis on positive thinking and the avoidance of morbid thoughts. Victorians believed that dwelling on negative emotions, anxieties, or the day's frustrations could literally overheat the brain, preventing it from settling into sleep. So, you might be encouraged to read uplifting literature, listen to soothing music, or engage in quiet, contemplative activities before retiring. The goal was to cultivate a serene mental landscape, free from the storms of worry. It was a kind of early cognitive behavioral therapy, albeit without the formal structure and empirical backing we see today. You can imagine someone trying desperately to think happy thoughts while their brain stubbornly replayed an awkward social interaction from earlier in the day. One mainstream historical fact about this era is the growing interest in the link between mind and body. While the understanding was often simplistic or based on philosophical rather than scientific principles, there was a clear recognition that mental distress could manifest physically, including through insomnia. Physicians and moralists alike began to preach the importance of a balanced mental life, suggesting that an overtaxed or agitated mind was just as detrimental to health as a poorly functioning liver. This laid some groundwork for later psychological disciplines, even if the initial interpretations were wide of the mark. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Victorian self-help manuals recommended specific mental exercises to induce sleep. One popular suggestion was to visualize a repetitive, mundane task, such as counting sheep. Yes, that trope goes way back. Or imagining yourself performing a simple, rhythmic action like knitting or weaving. The theory was that engaging the mind in a dull, unstimulating task would prevent it from wandering to more exciting or worrying thoughts, thus gently guiding it towards unconsciousness. Imagine trying to visualize every stitch of a lengthy tapestry, only to realize you've accidentally designed a rather garish antimacassar by the time you've actually fallen asleep. It certainly sounds like a test of patience more than a guaranteed sleep aid. Historians still argue whether these mental hygiene practices were truly effective in promoting sleep, or if their primary benefit lay in providing a sense of control and agency to individuals who felt overwhelmed by their sleeplessness. The very act of attempting to quiet the mind, even if imperfectly, could provide a distraction from anxiety and a structured approach to a chaotic problem. While perhaps not a cure-all, the Victorian exploration of mental discipline as a path to slumber shows their persistent, varied attempts to conquer the night. Our journey through Victorian sleep cures now takes us to a particularly tender demographic, children. If adults struggled with restless nights, imagine the additional anxieties of a parent in the 19th century, trying to quiet a crying baby or soothe a restless child without the benefit of modern pediatric knowledge or even reliable over-the-counter remedies. The solutions, much like those for adults, range from the gentle to the truly alarming, reflecting both genuine care and a significant lack of understanding about child development and safety. Imagine a Victorian nursery, perhaps dimly lit by a single gaslight, where a parent paces with a wailing infant. Sleep, for everyone in the household, depended on that little one settling down. One of the most common and perhaps understandable remedies for restless children was the use of soothing syrups. Remember our discussion about patent medicines? Many of these were specifically marketed for infants and children, promising to quiet colic, ease teething pain, and, most importantly, induce sleep. These were often sweet, sometimes flavored concoctions, making them palatable to little ones. The dark secret, however, as we touched on earlier, was that many of these contained significant amounts of opium, morphine, or even alcohol. You were, in essence, sedating your child, unaware of the long-term dangers or the potential for addiction. It was a desperate measure born of desperation and ignorance, and tragically, it often worked, creating a false sense of security for parents. Beyond chemical solutions, more traditional methods were also employed. Rocking cradles, of course, were ubiquitous, designed to mimic the comforting motion of being held. Lullabies, sung softly, were a universal tool for soothing. But Victorian parenting manuals also contained more specific, sometimes surprising, advice. Some advocated for strict routines, believing that predictability would lead to better sleep. Others suggested leaving a light on or a door ajar to comfort children afraid of the dark, a surprisingly modern piece of advice that many parents still use today. You might picture a weary nanny, humming a tune while gently rocking a child, hoping the simple rhythm would overcome any internal or external disturbances. One mainstream historical fact to consider is the incredibly high infant mortality rate during the Victorian era. While not directly caused by sleep remedies, the general lack of medical knowledge and the prevalence of diseases meant that childhood was a perilous journey. This high mortality might have inadvertently contributed to a greater willingness to try any remedy, however questionable, that promised to bring comfort or quiet to a suffering child. The stakes were simply so much higher. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Victorian parents were advised to use specific aromatherapy-like techniques for restless children. This might involve placing sachets of dried lavender or hops near the child's pillow, or even burning small amounts of specific herbs in the nursery. The belief was that the calming scents would subtly influence the child's nervous system, ushering in peaceful slumber. Imagine the gentle scent of dried herbs wafting through the nursery, a natural, albeit perhaps ineffective, contrast to the potent sedatives found in the syrups. It certainly sounds more pleasant than a dose of laudanum, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether the more gentle, non-medicinal approaches to childhood sleep, such as strict routines or comforting objects, were more effective in the long run than the widespread use of sedatives. While the immediate effect of opiates was undeniable, the long-term consequences of addiction and developmental issues were often severe. The varied and often contradictory advice highlights the era's struggle to understand and manage the unique sleep challenges of its youngest members, often with a mix of genuine affection and alarming naivety. Having explored the universal and childhood sleep struggles, let's now consider how the Victorian era often carved its remedies along gender lines, presenting gendered sleep solutions. While insomnia plagued both sexes, the prescribed treatments and the underlying societal assumptions about men and women meant that the advice given often differed significantly, reflecting the era's rigid social roles and prevailing medical biases. You see, a restless woman was often treated differently than a restless man, even if their symptoms were remarkably similar. Imagine yourself as a Victorian woman, suffering from chronic sleeplessness. Your doctor might attribute your condition to nervousness, hysteria, or the delicate nature of your female constitution. Remedies often focused on calming the agitated nerves or regulating the reproductive system, which was frequently blamed for a host of female ailments. You might be prescribed a sedative, perhaps a milder form of laudanum than given to a man, or advised to take long rests, engage in quiet activities like needlework, and avoid anything deemed overstimulating, which, for a woman, often included intellectual pursuits or too much social excitement. The emphasis was on repose and domesticity, ensuring you didn't overtax your supposedly fragile female system. Conversely, imagine yourself as a Victorian man battling insomnia. Your sleeplessness might be attributed to the stresses of the burgeoning commercial world, overwork, or too much intellectual exertion. The prescribed remedies for you might involve more robust physical activity, a change of scenery, perhaps a trip to a health spa or the countryside, or even a more potent tonic designed to restore vigor. There is often a focus on strengthening the nervous system rather than merely calming it, and less emphasis on quiet repose. The underlying message was clear. Men were active participants in the public sphere, and their health solutions reflected that dynamism. One mainstream historical fact to highlight here is the pervasive concept of nervous exhaustion, or neurasthenia, which, while applied to both genders, often carried different connotations. For men, it was seen as the consequence of overwork and ambition, a sign of too much intellectual or business strain. For women, however, it was frequently linked to reproductive issues, domestic pressures, or simply a lack of purpose outside the home. This gendered interpretation heavily influenced diagnosis and treatment, often leading to very different recommendations for sleep. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medical texts of the era suggested that women's sleep was naturally lighter and more easily disturbed due to their more sensitive nervous systems. This justified everything from lighter doses of sedatives to recommendations for separate bedrooms, for the wealthy, of course, so that a husband's snoring wouldn't disturb his delicate wife. It paints a picture of women as perpetually on the verge of being startled awake, needing extra layers of protection from the harsh realities of the world, even in their slumber. One can almost hear the soft rustle of silk as a Victorian lady attempted to float into dreamland without disturbing her finely tuned sensibilities. Historians still argue whether these gendered approaches to sleep were genuinely based on observed physiological differences or were primarily a reflection of deeply ingrained Victorian societal expectations and the medical patriarchy of the time. While there are subtle biological differences in sleep patterns between sexes, the vast chasm in prescribed remedies seems to owe more to cultural roles than to pure science. These varied approaches highlight how even something as fundamental as sleep could be filtered through the lens of Victorian gender norms, offering distinct paths to slumber for men and women alike. Having delved into the sometimes peculiar, sometimes sensible, and often gendered approaches to sleep in Victorian times, let's now consider how this era, which was also a crucible of intellectual and scientific ferment, began to lay the very early groundwork for a more formal understanding of the mind and its disorders. This was the dawn of professional help, a period where early psychologists, neurologists, and even philosophers began to move beyond simple remedies and explore the deeper, more complex theories behind mental distress and, by extension, chronic insomnia. Imagine a shift, however subtle, from the local apothecary or the traveling mesmerist to the burgeoning clinics and academic institutions where minds were dedicated to studying the nervous system. While still rudimentary by today's standards, this was the era when medical professionals began to systematically observe, categorize, and theorize about conditions like insomnia, moving away from purely symptomatic treatment towards an understanding of underlying causes. Figures like Sigmund Freud, though his most influential work came later, were beginning to formulate ideas about the unconscious mind and its role in human behavior and suffering, including sleep disturbances. This wasn't about a quick fix. It was about analysis, about prolonged observation, and about delving into the intricacies of the human psyche. The development of neurology as a distinct medical field also played a crucial role. Doctors began to understand the brain and nervous system in more complex ways, moving beyond vague notions of nervous energy to more specific ideas about nerve impulses, brain function, and the impact of physical health on mental states. This nascent understanding, while still in its infancy, suggested that insomnia might not just be a symptom of a weak will or moral failing, but a genuine disorder with physiological roots. You might find yourself undergoing a more rigorous examination, with doctors asking detailed questions about your habits, your diet, and your mental state, attempting to piece together a coherent picture of your affliction. One mainstream historical fact to underscore is the establishment of the first psychiatric hospitals and asylums during this period. While often grim places by modern standards, their existence marked a societal recognition that severe mental illness required specialized care and study. Insomnia, particularly when persistent and debilitating, could be a symptom leading to such admissions, reflecting the severity with which it was sometimes viewed. These institutions, however flawed, were early attempts to provide structured environments for individuals grappling with profound mental and emotional distress, including intractable sleeplessness. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some early psychological theories, particularly those influenced by the work of Jean-Martin Charcot in France, to the underlying nervous imbalance. Imagine the perplexing cases these early doctors faced, trying to disentangle genuine sleep disorders from what they perceived as the dramatic manifestations of a highly strung nervous system. It was a fascinating, if sometimes bewildering, period for the nascent fields of psychiatry and psychology. Historians still argue whether the early focus on nervous diseases in this era was a legitimate attempt to understand emerging mental health challenges, or if it sometimes served to medicalize social anxieties and reinforce existing gender norms. Nevertheless, this shift towards a more professional, albeit imperfect, understanding of sleep disorders marked a crucial step away from purely anecdotal remedies and towards a more systematic, scientific inquiry into the complexities of the human mind and its relationship with rest. The Victorians, in their tireless pursuit of sleep, had begun to lay the foundations for the specialized fields that would one day offer truly evidence-based solutions. So, we've journeyed through the Victorian night, from opium tinctures to rocking beds, from cold water immersions to the first stirrings of psychological inquiry. It's a fascinating, sometimes bewildering, tapestry of desperate remedies and hopeful innovations. Now, as our journey nears its end, let's consider the legacy of Victorian sleep and how these often quaint, sometimes alarming, practices inform our own modern understanding of rest. What did they get right? What did they get wrong? And what echoes of their sleepless struggles can we still hear today? Imagine a continuum stretching from the gaslit bedrooms of the 19th century to your own softly illuminated space. Many of their fundamental ideas, however clumsily applied, still resonate. The emphasis on a calm environment, we still dim the lights, reduce noise, and ensure our bedrooms are conducive to rest. The importance of exercise and fresh air? Absolutely. We know that physical activity during the day is a cornerstone of good sleep hygiene. The sensible advice to avoid stimulants like caffeine and alcohol before bed? That's still in every sleep expert's handbook. So, while their methods could be extreme, the underlying principles were often surprisingly sound. What they perhaps misunderstood, or simply lacked the tools to address, was the intricate complexity of sleep itself. They saw insomnia as a direct problem to be solved with a specific intervention, rather than a multifaceted issue influenced by diet, mental health, underlying medical conditions, and even genetics. They lacked the understanding of circadian rhythms, the powerful internal clock that dictates our sleep-wake cycles, and the precise neurochemistry that governs our journey into dreams. Their solutions, therefore, were often blunt instruments in a very delicate biological machine. One mainstream historical fact that continues to influence us is the enduring fascination with self-help remedies. Just as Victorians devoured pamphlets on nervous diseases and bought countless patent medicines, we too are bombarded with sleep apps, supplements, and wellness trends. The desire for a quick fix for insomnia is as strong now as it was then, a testament to the universal frustration of a sleepless night. we still chase that elusive perfect night's rest with fervent hope. Here's a quirky tidbit to ponder. The Victorian preoccupation with nervous energy and overstimulation sounds remarkably similar to our modern complaints about screen time and digital overload. They felt their brains were overwhelmed by telegraphs and trains. We feel ours are overwhelmed by notifications and endless feeds. Perhaps the fundamental human challenge of quieting a busy mind in an increasingly complex world hasn't changed all that much, only the source of the stimulation. You could almost swap a Victorian's concern about the daily newspaper for our own anxieties about the 24/7 news cycle. Historians still argue whether the Victorians' widespread reliance on often dangerous sedatives ultimately hampered or helped the development of scientific understanding of sleep. While they provided immediate relief, they also masked symptoms and likely delayed a deeper, more rigorous inquiry into the true nature of sleep disorders. Nevertheless, their trials and errors, their fads and their flashes of insight, collectively form the intriguing prologue to our current quest for perfect slumber. As the echoes of gaslight dim and the distant hum of the Victorian city fades, we are left with the gentle murmur of history, whispering tales of a tireless search for peace. The heavy velvet curtains of the past slowly draw shut, cloaking the odd remedies and earnest attempts in the soft mantle of time. You've walked through their sleepless nights, seen their strange cures, and felt the quiet desperation that often accompanied the relentless pace of their age. The sounds of their world, once so vibrant and demanding, now settle into a hushed stillness, melting away like the last wisps of fog at dawn. Let the whispers of the past mingle with the quiet of your present, guiding you gently, surely, into the deep calm you seek. Close your eyes, let the soft weight of history settle upon you, and drift away.